Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of ThinkLandscape. My name is Andrea, and I will be your host today. In this episode, we are talking wealth, prosperity, and the economy. And okay, let's be honest. Most of us, when hearing these words, think about one thing, that is money. And of course, financial resources are an important part of today's conversation. But more and more, we're realizing that money alone isn't enough. Systems, strong communities, and access to land, water, and food. So, today we're asking, how do we protect our natural wealth while also creating lasting opportunities for people? And we're focusing our conversation on Africa, because this continent, despite its immense natural wealth, is acutely vulnerable to the climate crisis, to land degradation, and to diminishing global aid. So, at the same time, Africa has the youngest population in the world. That's a challenge, yes, but also a huge opportunity. So, how do we make sure people and nature thrive together? We're exploring today's conversation and today's topic with 3 inspiring guests, diving into community led solutions, youth led restoration, and new ways of thinking of our relationship with natural resources, development, and resilience. So, at any point, if you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or LinkedIn, make sure to say hi in the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. And join the conversation online using hashtag TalkLandscape. We would love to hear your thoughts and chime in at any point. We're going to show some of your comments, some of your answers, and some of your questions during this conversation. So let's jump in. Let me introduce our 3 experts joining us today. First of all, we have Kofi Akamani, who is an professor of forest recreation and conservation social science at the Department of Forestry of the Southern Illinois University. Welcome, Kofi. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Andrea.
Then we have Sidner Kemunto, who is the 2025 Dryland Restoration Steward. Welcome, Sidner. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Andrea.
And we'd like to introduce Nadia Citas, who is the Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Thematic Lead at Climate Development Knowledge Network at South-South North. Welcome, Nadia. And welcome everyone to ThinkLandscape. Let us know where you're watching from here in the chat. We can see people joining us from different parts of the world, so feel free to say hi. I would also like to start off our round of questions, start our discussion with exploring the topic of what would a green economy look like. And first of all, we need to kind of align amongst ourselves. What is our understanding of green economy, of a natural nature economy? So when you hear nature economy, what comes to mind in your context? Let's start with you, Sidner.
Well, for me, what that would look like really is a shift from GDP to focusing more on community well-being, where we look at people's access to water, people's access to food, people's access to lands where they can sustainably grow their foods, and where we are also looking at land restoration versus land degradation for profits.
What about you, Nadia? What comes to your mind when hearing about nature economy?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. It's normally when you say the word economy, you start thinking about money and you start thinking about markets. And I think one thing that's become very apparent is that the current economic system has got us into the mess that we're in at the moment, with these interconnected crises around climate change impacts, biodiversity loss, massive inequality. And so when I think of, the way that a nature economy could work, or an economy that is fueled by a much better relationship with nature, it's kind of unpacking and really thinking about the different values that we have. And currently it's mostly all of the instrumental values of nature that are reflected. So that means all of the ways that nature is good for us as people, and maybe not accounting for the other ways that we can value nature, which is around kind of reciprocity and care, the way that it supports communities, as Sidna mentioned, and also some of the regulatory functions that nature provides around supporting us to buffer the impacts of climate change, create kind of community wellness and resilience. And so all of those values combined, it would be much better to see that in the way that we think about kind of a well-being economy or a green economy or a nature-based economy. Because I think it's really, these limited set of values that have kind of dominated the way that we frame nature and engage with nature. And I think that's where, shifts need to change to a much more inclusive way that we conceptualize that.
And thank you so much for such a comprehensive initial answer, Nadia. I think that already gives us a lot of food for thought and talking points for our conversation. What about you, Kofi? Just to get us started, what comes to your mind when we talk about nature economy in your context? You've been working a lot with rural communities, both in Ghana and the US, so I'd love to hear your take.
Sure. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks to Sidna and Nadia for their comprehensive responses. I think they highlighted the issue really well, that older models of development tended to sort of neglect the environment. The notion is that economic growth generates automatic benefits for people and the environment. But we do realize that the focus on efficiency and specialization and competition eventually, yes, profits are generated, but they lead to various forms of social injustices, as well as environmental degradation. And so if we are truly interested in the kind of development that addresses social and environmental concerns, we need more integrative approaches that manage at appropriate scales, not only the global, and measures progress, not only using the GDP and other economic indicators, but ones that are more relevant to the values and aspirations of and the lifestyles of people in particular places. And so in many ways, it reflects what Nadia and Sidna have already talked about, that it's about a more holistic approach to development, one that recognizes that nature has value in itself, independent of the benefit that it generates for humans, and especially for the economy.
Thank you, Kofi. And you mentioned integrative approaches, which it means that basically everyone can contribute in different ways to building resilient economies, right? So now I want to pivot to Sidner, because I wanted to ask you on your work with rural communities and with women in Kenya, how do African women, especially in rural areas, are already contributing to building a more green economy or to build a nature economy?
Thank you, Andrea, for that beautiful question. And what really comes to my mind when I hear about women is first recognizing that women are the primary caregivers. And for the most part, when we are having, for example, hosting people around, the first thing that most women are responsible for doing really is ensuring how these people are fed and how these people eat, how everyone is interacting with everyone. And with that in mind, really, with my work with Kijani Mtani, I have observed women, especially young women, leading land restoration by actively planting even kitchen gardens. And in as much as most of these women don't have agency with the lands that they are working on, they are greatly contributing to making sure that there is sustainable food coming from the lands to sustain their family. So for me also, it's to recognize that the work that these young women are already doing in their communities.
Thank you, Sidner. That also kind of brings me to a question that I would like to pose, not only to both Nadia and Kofi to chime in and build up on, but also to the audience watching. So you mentioned how, for example, women who provide caregiving are not properly included into an economy, right? So we could say that the way that things are right now is our economy is kind of blind to certain people. So who else is being overlooked in the way we think about economy? I want to ask this to you, Nadia, Kofi, and our audience watching in the chat. So Nadia, over to you.
Yeah, that's I mean, so many people are currently overlooked, and I think so many of the more technocratic and regulatory responses to how we manage various different crises are have many blind spots. And one concept that has been really useful for us in thinking about the work that we do in terms of supporting locally led adaptation has been around integrating kind of intersectionality, and that sounds like a kind of a weird word. But at the heart of it, it really is recognizing that that people have multiple identities. So as Sidna mentioned, women as caregivers, a lot of the invisible labor that happens behind the scenes in terms of providing for a family or community is thinking about their multiple roles and people's multiple identities. So you could be a woman, but you could also be old or young. You could have different levels of education, a language, different language systems, ethnicities, and recognizing that each of those different identities combine in different ways and either privilege you or burden you in terms of access to decision making, access to resources. And so what I think we really need to do is embed a lot of that in decision making processes to ensure that they are inclusive and just. And it's asking the question that you asked: who's not in the room? Why aren't they able to be here? What types of knowledge can count in these decision-making contexts, and really valuing their experience of working with each other and working with the world and working with nature. And so, yeah, in addition to kind of acknowledging the role that gender plays, is also acknowledging kind of age and ensuring that the spaces include young people, old people, able-bodied people, and really making sure that if we are co-creating this new way of governing the world, we do it in inclusive ways.
And you mentioned age, which is really important, especially if we're discussing Africa, where we have such a young population. I think it's a very unique demographic, with nearly half of the continent's population under the age of 20, which really leads us to think about how do we come up with sustainable opportunities in the long term that actually work with those younger citizens right now. And before moving on to Kofi on your take on this question, I want to remind everyone in the chat that you are able to write in your comments directly on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on YouTube, because we are reading them. So we want to make you a part of the conversation that way. So feel free to chime in with your comments on the chat. So now, Kofi, over to you. Who is being overlooked by our economies?
Yeah, I would say Nadia and Sidna have really covered a lot of the the issues at stake. We tend to look at forms of marginalization in various ways. From a social justice perspective, you can think in terms of procedural equity, substantive equity, procedural in terms of who is involved in decision making, and a lot of things come into play. It depends on who has access to information, who has the ability to get involved, who has the resources, and even the time to get involved. And so issues like age becomes a big factor. Whether if you're too old or too young, right? That might become an issue. Or if you don't speak the right language, or a particular way of communicating, you become marginalized. And so you might even be present in a meeting and still not understand what is going on. And so the issue of procedural equity is a big issue. Then there's a substantive component: who actually gets what, at any given point in time. And that also becomes a big issue, because then you can think of marginalization even in terms of human settlements, where remote small communities in distant places distant from places of power may not have access to the kinds of opportunities that larger settlements with more resourceful and influential people might have. Uh, that might also go even for in terms of present and future generations. And so the issue of intergenerational equity might also come into play. Recognition aspects is also important, whose values and views of the world really matter in a particular sense. And here we can look at indigenous people in local communities, generally, the kinds of values that they may hold may not always be central to the way that national governments make decisions when it comes to what kinds of knowledge they are using or what they are managing their resources for. And so there are various forms of marginalization, and we can look at it in terms of the relationship between humans in nature, the relationship among humans, the relationship between present and future generations, relationships across human settlements, so on and so forth.
And well, now that we see that marginalization and seeing that these blind spots are very much present in this economy, I also want to discuss other types of barriers that we might have, to building a nature economy, a green economy. So let's talk about what's standing in the way of building nature-based economies in Africa. So starting with you, Sidner, what would it take for women to make sure that women and youth aren't left out of these economies, of these decision-making processes? What is one key challenge that you have seen throughout your work?
Again, Andrea, thank you for that question. I think Nadia and Dr. Kofi have shared a lot on that. And I would also love to point that agency to land is very important for most young women and women in general. I have observed, at least from my community, that land is a resource that has a lot of cultural norms limiting how we interact with land. And for the much part, there are patriarchal norms that limit most of women from engaging with lands or having agency with lands. So I think that is a huge barrier, and it would be very important for that barrier to be lifted so that most women can actively participate in building this economy, understanding that land is also a resource. And also for young people, a barrier that I've also witnessed is the challenge or the stereotype amongst most young people that perceives agriculture or much of the land activities to be sort of old-fashioned, especially because it's the older members in society that are known to be working on lands. And that stereotype on its own discourages most young people from finding space in working directly with land. Yes, so those are the two barriers that I've mainly witnessed.
And does that resonate with you, Kofi? You have been doing work, especially working with rural communities. So are those stereotypes real? How are they manifesting? And are there other barriers that you have observed?
Thank you. Yes, I'll say yes. The land tenure issue is indeed, a pervasive issue across the African continent. Over the years, we've seen a process of land reforms where the customary tenure system has been replaced with, land privatization and, nationalization policies. And those have often led to inequitable outcomes where land ends up in the hands of, affluent and politically connected people. And so that has not really helped, local communities. But we see a lot of benefits in the traditional system, but it also has its own issues as well, where maybe non-natives, migrants and others, and even women may not have equal rights as certain members of, of the communities. And so there are all kinds of issues with the tenure system that, require a more careful approach to ensure that there's tenure security for everyone if you're interested in sustainable resource management and food security. So I strongly agree with that. The issue of unfavorable attitudes towards agriculture and land-based, livelihoods. I haven't studied it closely, but it is. I frequently come across it that yeah, and so I think it is a barrier also. Some of the issues have already been mentioned. I think the issue of closely connected to the land tenure issue is also the issue of gender. Where access to land can also be a barrier for women and other segments of local populations in some places. So I think the gender issue is directly connected to the land issue. So beyond this, I would say, there are also issues of capacity, just the lack of resources. And I think the issue of declining donor assistance has come up, in this session, but we often assume that whenever we talk about community-based approaches, communities are, well informed, they are well equipped, and they are just ready to hit the ground running. But that is usually not the case. That in many situations, communities may already have suffered a lot of vulnerabilities from past unfavorable policies by national governments. Maybe their land has been taken away, benefits from resources have been accrued, have been extracted at national and even global levels. And so communities in many places tend to be marginalized economically. And for them to be able to sustainably take control of resources to promote a transition towards, a green economy, it requires, capacity building. So I think the capacity building component is often overlooked. Capacity building in terms of financial resources, but also in terms of knowledge and skills, and also institutional capacity building and the provision of infrastructure. So I think those are important. We also see a lot of talk about new ideas, but often the policies are not very enabling. And so the lack of enabling policies and legislation in particular places often serves as a disincentive to get stakeholders involved in these efforts. So I say capacity, incentives, information, and just having the right opportunities to actually get involved in particular places. Those are also challenges.
Exactly on that point, and thank you so much, Kofi, for such a comprehensive answer. Again, we're having an amazing panel right now. I'm loving all of these very comprehensive answers, learning a lot. We mentioned stereotypes and maybe some erroneous perceptions on agriculture and other types of involvement in sustainable economies. We have land tenure, we have gender, we have capacity building, and we have decision making. So who gets to decide on what is done with natural resources? So Nadia, I want to ask you how is how can a shift in power create governance systems that actually enable more sustainable economies or a nature economy, whatever you want to call it? What kind of shift in power do we need?
Yeah, that's such a crucial question, because I think one of the criticisms around the way that green economies are framed is they frame it as apolitical. It's just an environmental issue, and we can use nature and it can strengthen our economies without thinking about power. So who has access to resources? Who has access to decision making around those resources, as has been mentioned? Already. And so I think it's around, while we may have improvements in terms of some of the regulatory spaces, we don't have improvements in the political spaces. So really ensuring that decision making can happen at multiple different scales, and especially it's no longer this top-down process. So we have these amazing conventions. If you look at the text, with a couple of tweaks, if we were to realize a lot of the texts in the Rio Convention, so around land degradation and desertification, around climate change, around biodiversity, it is truly transformative if we actually do achieve some of those targets. And it has been seen through years and years of negotiation processes, like the fact that we're having our 30th COP at the end of this year for climate change, and we still have not reduced emissions, just shows that that way of making decisions is not working. And it's especially not working for many people on the ground, and especially for many people that aren't responsible for the emissions that we see today. So really supporting locally led processes, because people at the local level know exactly what they need. They have been living with nature, they have been co-evolving with biodiversity over many, many years. And they know, and they are local stewards and have already been stewards of those natural landscapes. And so making sure that whatever decisions are made are locally led. So there's a big difference, and let's just say in a field that I work in, which is around ecosystem-based adaptation, some funding through various mechanisms to implement ecosystem-based adaptation, but really different if it's just ecosystem-based adaptation implemented at a local level versus locally led ecosystem-based adaptation. And we really need more examples of how this can be done. And so I think people sharing their stories, people sharing their experiences, having case studies available for decision makers to see how it can be done in much more inclusive, participatory ways that draw on multiple different knowledge systems. Because I think the way that decision-making processes are based on, a lot of the time based on science and based on peer-reviewed science, and not necessarily accounting for the diversity of knowledge that exists from multiple different knowledge holders. So there are some processes that are advancing, and it's really great to see things like the new Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which really pays attention to the role of multiple values, multiple knowledge systems, diverse stakeholders being included in the decision-making process. But the kind of the importance is around implementation. So it's all very well having the text, but how do we actually do that and enact it? And I think that is linked to resourcing. And so Kofi mentioned the importance of capacity strengthening and also finance. And I think there are lots of ways that those can be made more, especially in terms of finance, more predictable, more patient, more accessible, because it's all very well having finance available, but many local organizations that are supporting locally led implementation activities aren't able to access some of these massive funds of money. The funding is often not predictable. You get a small tranche of funding and then it stops, and you've built up all of these amazing kind of social networks, restored ecosystems. And so you really need that sustained finance. And so that's what I see, as one of the big barriers. And I think if you shift that, so if you think of what would locally led financing be, that is already a shift in power. That's already saying, don't just accept our financial instruments. So if we think of carbon markets, biodiversity offsets, which have been designed in boardrooms, what could they look like if they designed with local communities who are already custodians of those landscapes, who intimately know the weather patterns, who know how animals migrate through systems. And I think that will go a long way into shifting some of the power dynamics that we see, and especially some of the insane inequality that we still persisting. It's just wild that we've got more billionaires than we've ever had before, and also much more people living below the poverty line. And those two things, it's just wild that they exist at the same time.
Wonderful. Nadia, thank you so much for highlighting the need to actually consider different types of knowledge and to shift that approach instead of going from top to bottom in how we design decision-making processes, switching to going to a bottom-up approach for locally led processes. Now, I wanted to go over to you, Sidner. As the founder of a local organization in Kenya called Kijani Mtani, you focus on addressing the intersection of gender, of the climate crisis, and of food security. I wanted to know if you have any learnings on locally led processes for communities to actually raise their voices and make decisions on their own work.
My biggest lesson so far has really been on honoring Indigenous knowledge systems. And this has mainly been a huge tussle, especially given the role that Indigenous knowledge is given. maybe in our perceptions of it. And most people often dismiss indigenous knowledge as this barbaric knowledge systems, or one that does not keep up with modern science. But really, I have learned that indigenous knowledge on its own is as important as modern science as a knowledge system. And much of my work has really been integrating indigenous knowledge to our land restoration initiatives, that we don't use this knowledge as a secondary opinion to our work, but as a primary source of information. And I also recognize that much of this information from indigenous knowledge systems is information that has been passed down the line for many, many years, information that has informed how and when people plant, what are the right crops for our land, what are the seeds that are resilient for our local climate systems. And integrating that knowledge to my work has really, really been central. And I have also appreciated how much we can also achieve resilience by also depending on indigenous knowledge. Yeah.
Now, I wanted to go back to you, Nadia, because Sidner, you mentioned the importance of passing down indigenous knowledge to take care of the land, for example, or to take care of the community, which brings definitely a lot of value to the way that we think about economy at the local level. Now, you, Nadia, as part of our research for this conversation, you shared a very interesting concept of the cultural values of nature. So, beyond thinking about what nature can give us in terms of economic value, there's also a huge cultural value within nature. So, can you tell us more about that?
I think, and it's something that both Kofi and I worked on together as well with the IPBES Nexus assessment. And essentially what IPBES is it's the intergovernmental platform for science policy platform for biodiversity and ecosystem services. So if people know the IPCC, which is a very famous assessment process, this is a sister assessment which focuses on biodiversity. And I think historically it's focused much more on like what can biodiversity do for us, and maybe also some like the intrinsic value. So just having biodiversity, just having diversity of species is a value in itself. But often overlooked in those is the relationship that people have with nature that has co-evolved over many, many years. And so my experience and my privilege of being part of IPBES for many years, and essentially what it does is assesses knowledge. And why it's unique, it assesses a diverse knowledge. So it's not only scientific knowledge, but it really looks at multiple forms of knowledge. And one assessment was the values assessment, and that really looked at the diverse values of nature. And that, we scoured through poetry, through art exhibitions, installations, and that gives you a sense of some of the different values that people have with nature. So those are lumped. If you're thinking about the research world, they put those under cultural ecosystem services. So they don't quite kind of produce food or water, and they're not regulating environmental processes, which would make them a regulating ecosystem service. So there are these cultural values, but they're equally important as some of those other categories because they're actually intertwined with them. So if we just think about our relationship with food, we don't just eat often because, we need to sustain ourselves. Food has multiple different values. It's linked to rituals and culture. It's linked to land. It's linked to seasonal patterns. It's linked to important events in our lives and in our communities' lives. And so food, it has multiple different values. And so, it can also have a tremendous cultural value. And if you think of Africa as a continent with its such diverse ecosystems, and then people who have co-evolved with these ecosystems over time, they've developed all of these different connections. So sense of place, sense of identity, some of the cultural heritage, the way that is captured then in the intergenerational knowledge that Sidna mentioned around, how stories are told, how people value the land. They wouldn't speak about it in economic ways. They would speak about how it, sustains us over hard times. Our connections to kind of the soil and to rain and songs about rain. And so this is how people have managed to persist on the continent for many, many years. And so recognizing those cultural values, and that can also be linked to tourism, to education opportunities, to inspiration, to wellness. There's an increasing amount of evidence now. Just time in nature really increases our health outcomes. And so that's one component, and it's a really important component, because often you can't put a value on that. So how do you, people try, they try to put an economic value on some of those things in terms of maybe tourism experiences, but often you can't. A cultural connection, a sense of place is really hard to monetize, yet it is so important. And it's the reason why we still have amazing biodiversity in the world, is because of people, local communities that have been custodians of those lands and species over many, many years, is because of those cultural connections. I can give so many examples. If you think of totems, if you speak to many people, they have totem animals that are, part of their identity, part of their culture. And so it's such an important thing to recognize, but has been distant, and a lot of kind of Western science has kind of distanced it, but it's coming back into assessment processes, into our understanding of the world. And that's really lovely to see. So I think there is a report that I think will also be shared, that it's a new handbook that has been released around how to identify that, how to bring it into decision-making processes. IPBES has got some lovely assessments on that as well. And I think that's really important. And sorry, this is just one thing that I also wanted to share when we were speaking about perceptions of, Indigenous knowledge, and some of these of being, not for younger generations. And I think especially important for younger generations that are now living in urban spaces. So in cities, and if we look at the demographics of Africa, that is where the majority of young people are going to be in the future. And how do you build those connections to nature, to Indigenous knowledge in those spaces? And so that's something that we're also exploring in the work that we do as kind of knowledge brokers in the program that I run. So that if there's time, we can get back to that. But I think just acknowledging that nature has multiple values, and there are lots of ways to account for that aren't just around money. And that's really, really important for getting a much more holistic understanding of the multiple different ways that nature contributes to our well-being.
Wonderful, Nadia. And I'm also seeing a beautiful conversation, super engaging, happening on LinkedIn. So hi, everyone watching on LinkedIn. We see your comments. I see some highlights of Africa's rich natural capital combined with innovative solutions, and how this can drive actual change in the continent, how we can build a green economy. We have Ben from the GLFX Ibadan chapter sharing about the Landscape Ambassadors project to improve landscape restoration through education, engaging with younger audiences. So hi, everyone in the chats. We see you. We love that you're joining this conversation, and keep those messages, those comments coming. Now, Kofi, over to you, because I wanted to ask you also about this very important role of rural communities in passing down knowledge, in becoming more resilient in the face of climate crisis. So what have you observed about how rural communities are adapting to climate, to economic changes, and what can we all learn from these patterns?
Thank you. This a very interesting question. The question of how communities act or respond to change has been the focus of a lot of social scientists are trying to understand how do communities act and the different forms of responses, coping, adapting, etc. A lot of what I've done comes from the resilience perspective. And I'll say much of the focus or much of the early work was more of trying to understand the general factors that influence the capacity of communities to adapt to various forces of change generally. And so these days people refer to that as general resilience. And so that is different from specified resilience, which is the capacity to respond to a particular form of threat. And so coming back to the general resilience, the issues might vary from one context to another, but generally speaking, communities tend to draw from different kinds of resources. We just call them capital assets. And so that might include social capital or human capital and natural capital, and economic capital, physical capital. And so natural capital has an important role to play, when we look at the capacity of communities to adapt. But it's not just the presence of these assets. Being able to mobilize them requires having effective institutions. Like Nadia was mentioning, we need the kinds of institutions that promote, meaningful stakeholder engagement, promote participation, accountability, etc., etc. And so, having effective institutions makes it more feasible to promote collective responses to various forces of change. Uh, there are instances where communities may have the resources, but in the absence of effective institutions, people act on their own, even where collective problems exist. And so having institutions serve as the glue to sort of help mobilize people to act. And so in many ways, those factors tend to play out when we look at how communities are responding. Uh, Having said that, there are still a number of ifs and buts, that we can talk about, in the sense that communities respond in different ways. Generally, we can talk about coping and adapting, which is the kinds of responses needed to maintain or return to some pre-disturbance condition. And then there's transformational change, which is needed when the existing situation becomes undesirable. Right. Let's say there's, a change in weather conditions that has made certain cultural farming practices or other traditions unsustainable. Then there's a need for capacities for transformation. And so some of the case studies tend to sort of show that the factors that influence coping and adaptation might not necessarily translate neatly into what it requires to sort of deal with the transformational aspects. And so there's a need for, a clearer understanding, right, in terms of what factors influence coping and adaptation versus what factors influence transformational change. Another issue has to do with the types of threats that we are talking about. And so generally we talk about climate change impacts, but climate change will manifest in different ways, floods, drought, heat waves, etc., etc. And so these are very specific kinds of threats. And again, it's difficult to sort of make generalizations about uh, whether responses to the mechanisms for responding to one threat are the same as those that are needed for another. And so with the issue of the distinction between general and specified, it requires, a more cautious effort to understand, because there tend to be trade-offs between, you might build resilience to a particular threat like floods, and that might probably make you vulnerable to another kind of threat, for instance. And so those issues are beginning to, they represent sort of knowledge gaps that, we are digging into. But having said all of that, there's still a lot of promise in the sense that communities routinely draw from local resources to demonstrate their resilience in the face of various forms of threats, whether it's climate related or the implementation of governmental policies or other mechanisms. And those include drawing from past experience. So past experience tends to be a very consistent factor when you look at how communities respond. That, communities are more resilient when they're dealing with a threat that they've dealt with in the past, right? And the knowledge gained from responding to those threats is stored again in the local knowledge that, Sidney was talking about, and also in the local institutions that, the set of rules, formal, the informal rules that shape the way that people relate with one another. And so local knowledge is important. Local institutions, particularly the informal institutions that, national governments and conventional resource management does not pay enough attention to, those tend to be important in getting communities to work together to address their common concerns. And then there's the issue of social capital, just the quality of social relationships among community members. And so when you put all these together, you realize that, economic capital per se is probably not the most important factor when it comes to building the resilience of communities. A lot of the issues tend to fall back to the informal rules and the local knowledge and the historical experience. and other kinds of intangible assets that we often don't pay enough attention to. And so that sort of offers some promise and highlights the need for more bottom-up approaches, because they sort of highlight the fact that communities have inbuilt resilience that can be nurtured. Resilience is not something that comes from outside of them, imposed upon the community. It is something that can be nurtured from a bottom-up approach. So I would say those are some of the issues that I have observed.
Thank you, Kofi. I want to first, before going over to Sidner for her take and for her perspective, I want to highlight an interesting comment I saw on LinkedIn from Eunice, who says, rural communities are often overlooked, yet they are usually the keys to sustainability. It is in the rural community where we find a lot of citizen participation, the passing down of secret knowledge that allows for the continuity of natural processes and the adaptability of diverse species. Sidner, do you agree with this? And what else would you add? How can rural communities, local communities, contribute to building to redefining the concept of prosperity for Africa?
I totally agree with that comment, Andrea. And I also don't think that maybe rural communities will be contributing. I feel like they are already contributing. I've personally been seeing a lot of innovations happening at the local level, where maybe young farmers are experimenting with traditional pest-resistant seed varieties when it comes to controlling the pests that are affecting their crop production, or reusing gray water, especially for my community that is being affected by water access, as it's a dry and arid region. And to some, maybe young women that have small pieces of land, they transform some parts of their plots to creating kitchen gardens that can sort of support them sustainably. And since the climate doesn't support a lot of water access and rain access, so for the most part, these kitchen gardens are very, very sustainable for this to these young women that are supporting such. And if you look at this on innovations, they are very small. They're not the flashy technologies that we might be talking about, but really they are smart. They are rooted to the local ecosystems. And most importantly, they are also powerful in redefining how we are looking at the green economy. So that would really be it.
Now, I definitely don't want to miss talking about the changing landscape of global funding. There have been definitely some cuts to development aid, and that has been affecting many regions worldwide. Now, I want to ask Nadia, how do you see this developing in the future? What kind of innovations, could perhaps help Africa overcome these changing landscapes and these changing funding landscapes?
Yeah, I mean, funding is such an important issue. It comes up every time we engage with people that are doing work on the ground, because labor should be valued. It costs money. But maybe one thing to point out, we often get these reports of donor funding and how that's declining and shifts in some of the funding landscape, but also recognizing that one of the biggest funders of initiatives is often through remittances. And so that is coming from people that, are maybe living elsewhere in the world, sending money back home, and that supports a lot of the activity that we're seeing on the ground, but it's not accounted for in kind of normal ways that we see how a lot of these efforts are funded. And so I think that just links to the earlier point around just increasing the diversity of ways that we acknowledge where funding flows from, where we acknowledge what type of knowledge is valuable, who's included or not included in decision-making spaces. So really embracing diversity. But in terms of funding, I think, so that's to say, and Sidna already mentioned it, people are doing it. They're doing it with limited funding. If I've had the extreme privilege of engaging with GLF's Youth and Landscape initiative over the last couple of years, and hearing from young people from across the continent who, with sometimes no funding at all, are doing incredible things. And that's not to say that they should continue with no funding. Absolutely not. But I think it is, how can we ensure that the funding that is available is made accessible? So even if we were to, increase the funding pot tenfold, it still doesn't mean that it would be able to be accessed at local levels. And so I think we also need to change the funding mechanisms to make sure that it can land in the hands of people that need it most. There are philanthropy. There's a lot more funding coming from philanthropies. And I think the importance of platforms like the GLF and others who amplify the work of people that are doing the heavy lifting on the ground is really important, because it makes them more visible. It amplifies the work that they're doing. They're able to connect and learn from other initiatives that are doing similar things, but it also gives them a platform so that funders can recognize them and to be able to understand where more funding is needed. So I think it's both, yes, I still definitely think we need to increase the funding available, but at the same time as fixing those structural barriers that stop a lot of small organizations. One thing that we've engaged with youth organizations, the perception is they're not able to handle large pots of money, but they're beautiful examples where youth-led initiatives are handling big pots of money and having phenomenal restoration impacts that also account for kind of people in those landscapes. So I think it's also thinking about, that element of funding. So the funding flows and making sure that is accessible, but also what the funding is for. So at the moment, we've got pots of funding for adaptation, pots of funding for mitigation, pots of funding for biodiversity conservation. And essentially, all of those things are interlinked, right? You can't handle any of those things in isolation because they are completely interconnected. And so one thing that we've also, and I can share a link afterwards, is thinking with some others around funding for resilience, because that really is seeing the whole system. You need to, of course, think about mitigation, reducing emissions, and a lot of the work is focused on that. And most of the funding does go to mitigation efforts. But also thinking about all of the resilience capacities that Kofi mentioned, like how do you ensure that funding supports those that are often, really crucial for the resilience of communities and for ecosystems, but are kind of missing in some of the big funding calls. And so it's funding for resilience that will cover mitigation, will cover adaptation, will think about maybe more diverse flows and really take a systems approach to funding. So it's not just one thing. And definitely, we've been involved in assessments where they've showed that investing in nature is really important and has so many co-benefits that aren't just around kind of returns of investment. It really is around supporting communities. So I've jumped around a bit in terms of funding, but it really is about, it's kind of the nature of funding, but also about accessibility and some of those characteristics, and trying to apply a more systems approach to thinking about how we fund initiatives.
Absolutely. No, and it's great that you mentioned so many different pathways that we could explore, which, I mean, we could continue this conversation for another hour together with the audience watching. However, we do have to wrap up or start wrapping up now. So I definitely, thank you, Nadia, and thanks everyone for chiming into this combo. Now, I want to kind of look into the future, also building up on discussions on innovations, but also maybe discussing how we can redefine the meaning of prosperity. How can we move forward with everything that we have discussed today? Starting with you, Sidner, what would be one key learning from today's conversation that you would like to share with our audience watching? How can nature and people thrive together from your point of view? I'm sorry, Sidner, if you can hear us, because I think your video might be frozen. Oh, I'm afraid. Let's see if Sidner can rejoin us. Hopefully her connection is reestablished soon. So then I will move over. Oh, Sidner, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you, Andrea. I'm so sorry for that disruption.
No worries. Do you need me to repeat the question, or?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So I wanted to ask you, Sidner, based on our discussion today and yeah, our reflections on innovation, on changing the way we define decision-making processes or how we build these structures, how do you think, or what can you share with the audience in terms of how nature and people can thrive together?
I think first we need to recognize that we already have the wisdom to coexist with nature as people and as nature. The wisdom already is inherent within us. What we may need is really to center that wisdom. And for me, as I think about a green economy, really for Africa and also for the whole world, really, it really must be built together with the hands of those that are already restoring the land, not just those that are managing it or exploiting it for profit. So really, we must join hands with those that are restoring land versus just those that are managing the lands.
Thank you, Sidner. That's a beautiful reflection. Now, I wanted to pass the mic on to Kofi. As you have recently participated in the launch, in the development of a brilliant report on how forests can help us redefine resilience. So, what would be one key takeaway, not only from this conversation, but perhaps from that report, that could help us lead the way in making nature and people thrive together?
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I think the report really highlighted the complex interdependence between uh, you know forest ecosystems and the human communities that depend on them. That forests provide multiple benefits, cultural, economic, social, even environmental benefits, not only to the communities surrounding these areas that we call forest dependent communities, but also to distant communities, including urban communities as well. But forest ecosystems are also vulnerable to various forms of threats, changing land use, climatic conditions, pollution, invasive species, etc., etc. And these are complex adaptive systems. There's always the potential for sudden change, which might be irreversible or very difficult to reverse, and outcomes might be negative on people and on nature. And so there's really the need to begin by recognizing the delicate nature of forest ecosystems and the fact that they are vital as a source of human well-being, and they need to manage them from a resilience perspective. That we need to manage to build the resilience of these systems using institutions that are multi-level, that are adaptive, that are able, that promote inclusive decision making, that draw from diverse sources of knowledge across multiple skills. Uh, Interestingly, we do have all kinds of examples, including uh, locally evolved solutions that can serve as starting points for building this kind of multi-level complex governance mechanisms for managing these complex adaptive social ecological systems.
What about you, Nadia? What's one key takeaway from today's conversation that we can all take forward on building a green economy, a nature economy?
Yeah, thanks. I think one thing that I took away from this conversation is that people are already doing things. They are already connected. They are deeply intertwined with nature, and they're doing fantastic things that can serve as an example for others on what this green economy looks like from an African perspective, because I think that's what we need. We need solutions that are contextually appropriate. And so that's one thing that I'm taking, is that those connections already exist. But maybe in terms of where they don't exist, and where we've seen incredible work from some of the partners that we work with, especially in urban spaces, is ways to connect. And that's through more arts-based techniques. So we've got a project, Grand Slam, that's using slam poetry to remind people of those connections. And so it's, it's this illusion that we disconnected from nature, and sometimes we just need a nudge to remember that we are deeply connected. Another example is Nature and People as One, who are having soccer tournaments to support restoration efforts and bring people into landscapes to understand how to be stewards. So I think there's lots of ways that we can stimulate our imagination through creativity, because we need to collectively reimagine a future, and it can only be done from people that are already doing the work. And that can show us
Thank
the
you
way.
so much, Nadia. And I love that closing message of opening up this conversation for everyone, not only those working directly in the land, but if you don't feel connected to nature, there are always ways to reconnect with your community, to get involved and contribute to a more to prosperity, or to kind of redefine the way we think about this. So thank you so much, Nadia and Sidner and Kofi, for this conversation. It was super insightful. And thank you, of course, so much to our audience watching. With that, I will wrap up today's conversation. But I want to close with an open invitation to everyone watching. So today we have explored how communities can build resilient futures by working with nature, by combining traditional knowledge, science, women-led initiatives to protect both people and ecosystems. And we'll be back soon with more Talk Landscapes episodes. But in the meantime, I want you to invite you, if this conversation inspired something in you, to keep it going and don't miss what's coming next. So join us online on the 19th of June for GLF Africa, where we will explore how Africa can build a thriving nature economy grounded in natural capital that works for nature and people. It's a free event, it's fully online, and it's open to everyone. So you can register today and be part of this important dialogue. Thank you once again to Sidner Kemunto 2025 Dryland Restoration Steward, to Nadia Citas at the CDKN in South North, and to Kofi Akamani, professor at the Southern Illinois University, for joining us on Talk Landscape. Thanks, everyone, and see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much.